I have presided over 1,100 tribunals in the service of the Conclave Adjudication Corps. I have sentenced warlords. I have dissolved entire trade syndicates on the weight of 3 recovered data cores. I have sat through confessions of such calculated brutality that my junior assessors requested reassignment rather than review the transcripts a second time. I mention this so that what I am about to describe is understood in its proper context. I'm not a being given to alarm. The human's name, as best our translation lattice could render it, was something close to David Mercer. Crew manifest listed a specialty in environmental systems maintenance, a mid-rank technical role aboard a Conclave-licensed mixed-species freight hauler operating in the Kethavar corridor. The hauler had been impounded on suspicion of carrying undeclared biological material. Standard enforcement sweep. The crew were brought to Kevernul for processing and held in our standard intake facilities while the manifest discrepancies were resolved. What was not standard was that 3 days into their detention, Mercer was no longer in their assigned cell. They were found 41 hours later in a decommissioned maintenance corridor on the station's 7th ring, a section of Kevernul that is not on any publicly accessible schematic, that requires navigation through 6 access-restricted transit junctions, and that the human had never been within 800 meters of before their detention began. They were sitting with their back to a wall that placed 2 exits within reach. They were eating from a ration pack that had come from a supply locker whose lock code had been manually cycled, which should have required either a conclave maintenance key or precise foreknowledge of the facility's rotation schedule. The security review concluded they had neither. My tribunal was convened to determine how they had done it. We brought Mercer into the chamber at the second bell of the mid-cycle shift. They sat down across the table from my panel of 5 without being directed to do so. They simply looked at the chair, looked at the table, and sat. The restraint bracelet on their wrist was a standard compliance model rated for species up to twice their mass and sensitivity threshold. They did not appear to notice it. They folded their hands on the table and waited. My second assessor, Jareth Cole, opened the formal questioning. He asked Mercer to describe, in their own terms, how they had exited the cell. The human thought for a moment. Not the way a being thinks when they are constructing a lie. I have watched enough liars to know that pause. But the way a being thinks when they're trying to find the simplest words for something that, to them, requires no particular explanation. The cell door, they said, had a pressure seal mechanism. The seal flexed at irregular intervals. I counted the pattern over about 6 hours. Every 91 minutes, there was a micro-decompression cycle, maybe 2 seconds long, during which the magnetic housing stepped down by roughly a third. I timed it and pushed on the 3rd cycle. It opened. Jareth Cole wrote something on his record panel. He asked how the human had known to count the cycles. Mercer looked mildly puzzled. I didn't know, they said. I just noticed them. It's something you notice. My 3rd assessor, a Vathali named Ormiz Saa, leaned forward. She asked Mercer to describe how they had navigated from the detention block to the 7th ring without a schematic. Mercer described it. They described it the way I might describe a journey I had taken 100 times. They spoke of guard rotation intervals, 2 guards on a 40-minute cycle, overlapping by 6 minutes at the northeast junction, which left a 4-minute unobserved window. They described air current patterns in the service corridors, the way recycled atmosphere in a sealed station always flows toward the largest heat differential, which on Kevernul meant it flowed toward the reactor cooling vents on Ring 7, and that following the air was more reliable than following a schematic anyway. They described how lighting in maintenance corridor cycles at different intervals than in occupied areas, and how you could tell occupied from unoccupied sections by the color temperature of the overhead panels, even through a sealed access door. They described 3 contingency routes they had not taken, and explained why they had dismissed each one. The chamber was very quiet. My senior assessor, Prius Vonar, who had served on military intelligence panels for the Conclave before moving into civil adjudication, asked the question that I had been formulating myself. She asked Mercer whether they had received training in escape methodology, infiltration, or tactical navigation. No, Mercer said. I fix air recyclers for a living. Vonar asked whether they had studied Kevernol's layout prior to the impoundment. No, I'd never heard of this station until they brought me here. Vonar looked at her record panel. Then she looked at Mercer. You described the rotation intervals of our security personnel with a margin of error of less than 30 seconds, she said. You identified a micro-decompression vulnerability in a cell door mechanism that is 14 years old and has never been flagged in any maintenance audit. You navigated by atmospheric pressure gradient to a section of this station that does not appear on public maps. And you did all of this in 72 hours, having arrived with no foreknowledge. Yes, Mercer said. Ow! The human was quiet for a moment, not troubled by the question. More, I thought, trying to decide whether the honest answer would sound strange. You look at a room, they finally said, and you just count things. Not on purpose. You count exits, you count how many steps to each one, you notice whether the door swings in or out and which side the hinge is on. You clock the rhythm of anything that moves, guards, air currents, mechanical cycles. It's not a skill. It's more like you can't really turn it off. Vonar said nothing. Mercer continued. I've been doing it since I could walk. My mother did it. My grandfather did it. We grew up in places where it mattered to know where the exits were. And I guess at some point it stopped being conscious and became something else. I asked, and I want to be precise about this because I have reviewed the transcript many times since. I asked Mercer whether they were doing it now. They glanced around the chamber. It took perhaps 3 seconds. This room has 4 exits, they said. The main door behind me, the one I came through, has a standard slide lock and opens outward. The secondary panel on the left wall is a maintenance access, recessed about 6 centimeters. The seam gives it away, probably opens with a push plate on the inside. There's a vent housing in the ceiling at the northeast corner, about 60 centimeters on a side, which is larger than your standard recirculation return and suggests it connect to a major routing trunk rather than a stub. And the floor drain in the southeast corner is sealed with a friction cover rather than a bolted plate. She had named, with total accuracy, every non-primary egress point in Adjudication Chamber 3 of the Kevernol Conclave facility. She had been in the room for 11 minutes. We recessed the tribunal for an unscheduled interval. My panel of 5 sat in the anteroom, and no one spoke for some time. Vonar eventually said, with the flatness of someone reporting a data point they would have preferred not to encounter, that she wished to add a note to the formal record. The note she added read as follows. The subject does not appear to be conducting deliberate tactical analysis. The subject appears to be doing what their species does in any enclosed space, as a matter of unremarkable cognitive baseline. The formal finding of the tribunal, filed under Conclave Security Reference Can 0044, Terran, reached 3 conclusions. First, the human crew member designated Mercer had committed no deliberate act of sabotage and had made use of no external assistance. Their escape from detention was a direct consequence of standard human perceptual function operating in a standard conclave detention environment. Second, the 2 conclusions above should be read together. Third, pending a full review of conclave detention architecture by the Security and Containment Bureau, no human detainee should be held in any facility whose interior geometry they have had more than 30 minutes to observe. The review should be treated as urgent. I signed a finding myself. Mercer was released to a holding vessel pending resolution of the original manifest discrepancy, which was ultimately determined to be a clerical error. They left Kevernol on a connecting freight run 12 days later. I watched the departure on the station feed because I wanted to see. They walked through the boarding corridor the same way they had walked into my tribunal chamber. Hands in their pockets, no hurry, gaze moving in that particular way I now knew to identify. Taking in the dimensions, counting the exits. They did not know I was watching. They would not have changed anything if they had. That was, I think, the part that stayed with me.